Hey everyone, Daniel Huffman here, and I just wanted to share with you today a little technique that I've used in the past for creating semi-random fill patterns. These are things that can give your map a little bit more of an organic feeling. I want to show you how to do this in Illustrator. That's what I'm most familiar with, most comfortable with, but the ideas that I'm going to show you here could really be done in other programs too. And we'll circle back to that near the end and talk about some ways that you might enact this in GIS, for example. But for now, I'm going to stick with Illustrator. And the first thing I'm going to need is a uniform grid of dots. We're going to semi-randomize it later, but first we're going to start with a uniform grid of dots. And there are a few different ways to get this done in Illustrator. Right? We could use pattern fills. We could select a dot and manually create copies of it using the arrow keys and holding Alt to create copies. But the way that I want to do it is to use the transform tool. And all these ways have their advantages, but this is just one that I want to show you. So first off, I'm going to start with a blank screen here, blank slate in Illustrator, and I'm just going to create a dot. I've got my ellipse tool selected, and I'm going to click once, and it's going to ask me how large I want my ellipse. So I'm just going to say 3 points by 3 points. So that's a nice perfect circle here. And now I need to make some copies of this, so I have a grid of them. So I'm going to select this thing, and I'm going to go up to the Effects menu, and I'm going to go to Distort and Transform, and choose Transform. And I got a few different options here. I can rescale this thing, I can rotate it, not that you'll be able to tell if you rotate a circle in this case, but what I want to do is I want to move this thing. And I'm going to say move this, let's move it, 5 points. And if you notice after I've selected that, if you look back to the left at my original art here, the circle has moved. But the selector, the thing in blue here, hasn't. Because this is a live appearance effect. If I just click OK and apply this here, you can see when I select this circle, I have to select it over here. Right? It's right here. It's just saying that take whatever shape we have drawn here and actually draw the color for it, the fill, 5 points to the right. If I hit Command Y here and go into the outline mode, you can see my original raw vectors, just 4 points here, my Béziers, are right there. But when I look at the overall appearance, it's just being drawn 5 points to the right. And even if I reshape this thing, I can reshape it, and it's taking whatever is drawn here in the paths and shifting it over. So I'm just going to undo that. So that's kind of a fun thing the transform appearance does. And you can see in my appearance panel, that's what's being applied to the object, is a transform. But I'm going to click this thing and go back and edit my transform. Right? Anything in the appearance panel, if you click its name, you can go back and you can edit it later and you can change it, which is nice. These things are not burned in. They're not permanent. They're always changeable later on, which is pretty handy. So I'm going to say keep that 5-point transform. But there's one more option I'm going to turn on down here that's called copies. And let's type in a number 5. Now notice what's happened. It kept my original piece here, right where I had original vectors drawn, and then it did 5 copies to the right. Right, so if I go back to 0, 0 is what we had, and it has no copies, and it just moves the thing. If I have 1 copy, right, now we've got 1 copy off to the right, and we keep the original. So you can see how this might be useful in making a grid. If I say make 10 copies, now I've got a total of 11 dots here, the original and 10 copies all to the right, each spaced at 5. Let's shift this a little bit. Let's make that 7. Spread them out a little bit more. That's looking pretty good. So let's click OK. Now these are not individual dots. Right? If I go back to the outline view, there's just one thing here, and it's all copies. But I need to be able to move and play around with these things, so I need to make these quote-unquote real. So the way I do that is if I select this object here, and I go to Object, Expand Appearance, I can say take whatever you've got in this live appearance that's not burned in, and make it real, as it were. Turn these into actual vectors. And so now you can see these are each individual objects with their own vector paths. If I go to my layers panel, things got a little messy, just the way it does. It happens to do this in Illustrator. It put each thing in a group, and that group is in a group called ellipse. So I'm going to have to ungroup these things. When you expand appearances and sort of make real and live the effects that you're applying, they tends to get messy. So I'm just hitting Command-Shift-G to ungroup here. You can also go to Object, Ungroup, which would be highlighted if I had some things in grouped. So now I've got 11 paths here, and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to go Transform, Distort and Transform, and then just hit Transform again. And this time I'm going to do a 7-point vertical shift, and I'm going to make 10 copies. And now I've got a grid of dots. And I'm going to go and expand that appearance and ungroup. And again, there is other ways to make a grid of dots in Illustrator. This is just one I wanted to show you because it shows off that nice feature of making copies in the transform appearance, and it shows off the transform appearance in general. But however you get to this point, doesn't really matter. We just want a grid of dots. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make these dots move around a little bit and change size a little bit. Right now it's very uniform, it's very even, and it's very artificial looking, and what I want to do is give these dots just a little bit of motion, a little bit of difference from each other. So the way I'm going to do that is with a very similar looking dialog box. And this is a little bit of a challenge in Illustrator in that it often has multiple dialog boxes that look similar but occur in different places and do slightly different things. So I'm going to select all of my dots here, and I'm going to go up to Object, Transform, Transform Each. And this looks pretty similar to the previous box that we saw, except this is the Transform Each box, and the other one was the Transform dialog box. But you can see it's got scale sliders, it's got move sliders, rotate, etc., a bunch of checkboxes. The big difference here is that the things we do in this dialog box are permanent, whereas before they were just temporary appearance effects that were live. So if I say, move these dots by 10 points, you notice they all move, and if you look at the little blue highlights on them, the actual vectors themselves are moving. Whereas before, if I just back out of this for a second and go back to the one we were using before in the transform in the effects menu, if I tell it to move things by 10, and you see they stay behind. Right, the original vectors are unchanged. This is just a temporary appearance that's being applied to them. But in the transform menu, this is permanent. This thing will actually move and they'll stay that way. Each of these two dialog boxes has an important difference as well besides that. The previous one, let me go back to that. The reason we used that one was because it let me make copies. So you can even see now I've got a copy shifted off to the bottom. It remembered some of my previous settings when I went to apply that effect again. So this is useful for making that pattern. This one here, up in the object menu, doesn't have that option. So that's why we used the previous one to make those copies. We couldn't do it with this particular version of the dialog box. This version of the dialog box has something, though, that we can't get in the other one, which is the random button. Or at least it works very differently in the other one. This one, if I check this random button, it will take any appearance I apply here and apply different amounts of it to each object. So let's say I want to move these things by 5 points. They all shifted, but now if I click random, only some of them shifted, and those that did shift only shifted part way. Right, they're moving up to 5 points. And up to 5 points vertically, now that I've added that. That's what this random box does. Instead of shifting them all to the right and down, some of them shift, some of them don't, and they all shift different amounts. Same thing with scale. Let's do 75% horizontal and vertical scaling. Actually, let's make that a little more extreme so it's easier to pick up. 40%. Now some of them shrank up down to about 40%, and some of them didn't, and some of them are in between. So if I zoom in here, and again, if I go to Command Y, look at my outline view, you can see this is actually written directly into the vectors. This is permanent now. But you can see they've all shifted some, and they've all shrunk some. So I'm just going to undo that, go back to Transform Each, and do that one more time. And these are settings we'd want to play around with for our individual usage. How random do we want it? Do we want it to be subtle or extreme? I'm doing a pretty strong one here of randomness. And of course, the spacing of your original dots will affect this as well. Here now I've got some dots overlapping. Maybe that's too much for me, maybe that's great. So this is the kind of thing you might want to play around with. That's what this random will do for you. There is a random tool. I'm going to point this out just so you don't get confused. Let me undo this. If I select all these and go back up to the transform menu here, there's a random button here too. And you may think, well, why don't we just do that? Because this way it's always nice to make things not permanent, right? So you can change them later. But the downside of this one is that if I say 50, 50, 5, 5, it does it by a random amount, but it does it to all of them. And so that's no good. Can't have that. So that's why we're doing things that way. Let me just get my layers panel back here. I just like to have my layers panel with me. Just part of the way I like to have Illustrator set up. So yeah, we've got, each of these has their own transform, and yes, they're not really there. It's been shrunk and moved, but it did it the same to each one. I could go in and apply this transform one at a time and get it to roll a new random number each time, but that's a pain. I want to be able to do this all at once. So that's why I did it the way I did it. Up here with the permanent transform. So now we've got a bunch of random dots. The last thing we need to do is just turn it into a pattern that we could repeat somewhere over our map or other artwork. And to do that, I'll just select all these things and I'll go to my pattern options window and pull this over here and say, let's make a pattern from all the stuff I've got selected. And there's a lot of different options here, and you can kind of play around with these. I'll leave that as an exercise to you about the way it tiles, for example, or the width, right? You can change these things. One thing I might do is spend a while fiddling around with the edges to make sure they look nice. Say maybe certain things are a little too close to each other. If I shrink this in, say, do I want to move this dot here? Fine-tune that dot, etc. These are things that you might want to do if you're going to use a pattern a lot. Really fine-tune the way that those tile edges join together, and I've done that before. But for our purposes, we'll say, this is good enough. This looks pretty nice. It's a nice random dot fill. So I say that I'm done. And now I have a pattern that I can use, and it's been appended here to the edge of my default swatches that have come up when I opened Illustrator. So if I zoom out a little bit, I just draw a shape. Let's just draw a random blob here. Join that edge together with the Command J there to just join 2 points. And now select my pattern. And now we've got that filled in. And it just repeats over and over. But there's enough randomness, and it's a pretty large swatch, that it'd be hard for people to notice that it's repeating. And if you're worried about that, you could always make a larger grid of dots and a larger random dot pattern to start with to make sure that people don't notice that. Let me show you real quick an example of this in use cartographically. So here is a map of an island in Lake Michigan called Beaver Island. And this is actually an inverted image. I printed this out as a negative for use in a project. Perhaps you've seen before my Atlas of Great Lakes Islands. It's a cyanotype printed atlas, and I used that image as a negative to create this map here. So everything you see in Illustrator that's white turned blue, and everything that's black turned white. But you get the idea. We don't need to dive into that too much. But I just want to zoom in here and point out this pattern here. This is meant to represent forests. Where is there forest cover on this island? So I wanted it to have a little bit of an organic feeling to it, not perfectly uniform. You notice the dot movement and the dot resizing is much subtler than the example that we just put together. So we don't need to go crazy with this kind of thing to give just a nice subtle feeling of organicness to it. And in this case, you notice the dot tiling is a little bit different. I actually started with a hexagonal grid of dots. Right, you can see the base dot grid that I started with. You can probably imagine if these were straightened out and more uniform a little bit. Right, they're just offset a little bit, where there's one row of dots and then the next row is offset from that slightly, and the next row is offset from that, so you get these little hexagons of dots, for example. So I started with that. That was what I liked, and then I just randomized it just a little bit, and I made a pattern fill out of it. And I click this object, you can see the pattern fill comes up here as Woodland 2, because took me a couple of tries to get it right. So that's an example of this kind of thing in use. Now, I mentioned before that you could probably enact this outside of Illustrator. You could imagine, for example, going into a program like QGIS or ArcMap or something like that and creating a grid of point features. And then you could create an attribute in that set of point features that you fill in a random number into that field, and then you use that random number to control the size of the dots. And maybe you use it to control the offset of the dots. Maybe you start with a grid of dots and you pull all of their latitude, longitude locations, and then you use into an attribute table. And then you take those attributes and you just add or subtract a little bit from each latitude and longitude, and then you recreate a new set of point features based on that. And so this way you get a little bit of horizontal, vertical motion in them too. So you could imagine these techniques translating over just with some different tools into GIS as well if you want to do something like that. So I hope that was useful to you. I'd be curious to see how people enact this technique, either in Illustrator, in other programs, in GIS, or whatever. But otherwise, that's it. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope this works for you, and thanks so much to my patrons for helping make tutorial videos like this possible.